My psychopathic mother-in-law tried to steal my farm. I live in a very rural area on a small ranch that has been with my family since my grandfather. I met my wife 6 years ago when she started working on my farm. She was very open with me, but there was one topic she always avoided. Her mother. The professor, as she called her, worked in a college teaching a class I most likely would never attend. Her father was, as wife described, a weak man that does what the professor demands. Some of the things the wife described the professor in doing sounded absurd and borderline insane. It included her trying to get my wife a girlfriend in middle school, insisting my wife was a lesbian. There was a period where the professor wanted to live a natural lifestyle, and she asked her husband's brother to let them live on his farm. Within a week, the professor hated the farm and dragged them both back to the city. My wife, on the other hand, felt like she finally found something she liked and really connected with her uncle, who she admired greatly. My wife left home when she was 16 and lived with uncle until she was 18. All while she was with uncle, the professor kept threatening to drag her back. She never did. After wife turned 18, she went to school and received a 4-year degree and tried to work an office job, but found it unfulfilling. She started to take the bus and work odd jobs in rural areas, looking for something that fit what she was looking for. That was when our paths crossed. Last year, around March, we started getting mail addressed to the professor and father-in-law. I found this strange, and my wife wanted to trash it. I started marking them return to sender and no such occupant and dropped them right back into the mailbox. This came to a head in October when I was cleaning up the yard and a bright white SUV drove up with a U-Haul attached to it. Wife looked up and turned pale. "Oh God, it's them," she said. Out stepped a rotund beluga and a thin man that only had a passing resemblance to uncle. The professor immediately walked up to wife. "Professor, well, let me have a look at you. It's been years." Wife: "Mom, what are you doing here?" Professor: "The university is doing virtual classes. We figured we can self-isolate at our ranch." The R had a weird emphasis. Me: "Excuse me, but this isn't your ranch." Professor: "Oh, I'm sure we can have the ownership all cleared up." "Well, aren't you going to invite us in?" Me: "Ma'am, you may be my wife's mother, but you are a stranger to me. I would rather not." The professor turned to father-in-law and told him to make a phone call of sorts. Father-in-law instantly got on the phone with the police and started spinning a tale about us not letting them into the house that they equally own with us. I couldn't believe what I was hearing and how insane it was being spun. Luckily, I live in a small town. The sheriff pulled up, and it was someone I knew for most of my life. The sheriff really embodies the mindset of a small-town constable. He tries to be a peacemaker and a peacekeeper first and foremost. He also knew that this land was in my family's name for 3 generations. "Sheriff, what's this I hear about you selling half your ranch, Duke?" Me: "I didn't. These are my wife's parents and they think they have a legal stake on my land." Professor: "Not think, no. We've lived here since February with tenant laws, that means." Sheriff: "Funny, I don't remember you in town." That shut the professor right up for a second, but then she reached in her bag and pulled out a stack of letters. A lot of them are the bills and bank statements, with the ranch's address. Professor: "Then how do you explain these?" Sheriff took the letters and looked at them. Sheriff: "Ma'am, these are all marked return to sender." The professor turned desperate. "Professor, please. I haven't seen my daughter in years. I just want to make sure she's okay. Surely you can see that he is controlling her every move." Sheriff rolled his eyes and walked over to talk to wife and I again. The sheriff likes to solve problems between people. And he hasn't encountered this level of crazy before. Sheriff: "You might just want to invite them in for coffee. Talk for a few minutes." Wife: "They are your parents." Wife: "If you leave them here, you will just have to come back in 5 minutes to handle an assault." Sheriff: "Wife, you can't mean that. They're your family. Look, I'm just going to head up the road. Invite them in, talk to them." Wife got a bit of an angry glint in her eye. Wife: "Does this mean you're going to invite your cousin Aaron to Thanksgiving?" Sheriff's cousin Aaron was currently serving 8 years for a multitude of felonies. Sheriff's entire family consider him the family shame. With that statement, the look in the sheriff's eyes changed. He gave wife a look like that bad, huh? And wife merely nodded. Sheriff turned back to the professor and father-in-law. Sheriff: "All right, they don't want you here. Best you two not come back." The two protested briefly, but then piled back into the SUV and drove off, with the sheriff trailing right behind to make sure they were completely off the property. This was the first time I met the professor and father-in-law, but it definitely stuck with me. My psychopathic mother-in-law tried to steal my farm. In December, my mother-in-law's efforts got crazier. I stopped into town to get some supplies, and by the time I was done packing up the truck, my mother-in-law, or rather the professor, tapped me on the shoulder. This time she actually acted cordial. I chose to be curt. She basically begged me to at least listen to her for 5 minutes in the local cafe. I didn't want her to create a scene on Main Street, so I agreed. We sat and the professor talked. She claimed my wife was always confused about who she was, and that the professor and father-in-law had only her best interests in mind. I didn't want to yell, shout, accuse, or throw anything back in her face. I was just waiting out the clock. She said my wife saw you coming and wedged herself into my life. At that I did push back at. I said that I felt I was blessed to have her in my life. Hoo boy, those were the wrong words to use with this woman. Professor, what do you mean blessed? I put my head in my hands and just wished this was over, everyone in the cafe looking at the two of us. The professor really projected her voice with this sentence. Me, ma'am, if you're trying to win me over, I suggest you stop using vinegar. She sort of humped at that statement. But she did become cordial again. She dug into her purse and pulled out a flash drive. She placed it on the table in between us. Professor, fine, this is all the proof you need. Take a look and I promise you will know the truth. I was dying on the inside from embarrassment from how my mother-in-law acted, with people I do business with regularly all watching. They will want to know what happened and why. I took the flash drive and left. I got back to the ranch where my wife was waiting and she could instantly tell something happened in town from the ticked-off look on my face. I explained what happened in town and held up the flash drive. Wife looked confused by it. We plugged the flash drive in and there were stacks and stacks of PDFs. The whole thing was a thesis of sorts with my wife as the subject. I'm not even sure what the point of it was, or what the professor was testing on her own flesh and blood. It detailed her first playing with toy dump trucks when she was a child to dressing in overalls during the brief time they lived with her uncle together. All of it was cold, detached, and as my wife put it, clinical. My wife was referred to as subject throughout. It was bizarre. And I'm still not sure what the point of it was. My wife looked disgusted at the PDFs and insisted we burn the drive. Which we did in the fire pit. That was the last time we heard from the professor. My wife thinks more is coming. Update 2, my psychopathic mother-in-law tried to steal my farm. We FaceTimed my wife's uncle to get some more insight on the mother-in-law, or rather the professor. At first, her uncle gave very short answers. But when I told him about the weird play for the ranch, he finally was willing to give a bit more information. Turns out she tried the same thing with his farm. He said the professor was a big reason why him and his brother don't talk anymore. Wife's uncle's sheep farm was part of a much larger piece of land owned by my wife's grandfather. The grandfather had 3 kids, 2 sons and a daughter. The daughter went off to the East Coast and works a high-paying executive job of some type. The grandfather split his property into 3 slices when he died. His daughter sold her part to uncle for almost nothing. She didn't want rural property nor had she made a claim for it, and knew uncle wanted to keep the farm going. The other son, my father-in-law, sort of kept ownership but gave permission for uncle to keep using it. That was until he wanted to go to an expensive university. He sold his part of the land to uncle for a good chunk of change. Uncle got to keep all of grandfather's land in one piece. In college, father-in-law dated the professor, and then married. Uncle heard bits and pieces, but father-in-law just only called during Thanksgiving and his birthday and that was about it for many years. A few years later professor was in, as the uncle called it, a hipster phase and heard about the farm. She didn't just show up. Father-in-law asked first and my uncle agreed, letting the professor and my future wife come over and work for a bit. Father-in-law knew what rural life was like, but the professor didn't. Uncle described it as the professor had a vision of waking up to a kale smoothie, digging up beets for lunch and enjoying the sun the rest of the day. If you live on a farm or a ranch, you're spoiled for choice when it comes to daily chores. Uncle's farm was primarily a sheep farm, but they had a vegetable garden and a small orchard. This meant work. Uncle was easy on the professor. She was only given a few chores, such as clipping dead vines in the garden and airing the compost. She apparently treated this like an ordeal. She nearly destroyed the tomatoes uncle was growing that year, and he had to redo the compost every evening. But the way she complained, you'd think she was tending the orchard and the sheep. She did not like manual labor. But she was also oddly in love with the idea of a farm. My wife on the other hand took to it like a duck to water. She loved to check the fences, check the flock, dole out the feed, and tend to the small vegetable garden. Uncle said that they had a local butcher that came once in a while for a few lambs, depending on price and demand. Butcher visited once during the professor's time on the farm. Butcher was a black man, which uncle didn't mind or care. Professor cared. She made a big show of greeting him, shaking his hand, and talking to him in a very sing-songy, high-pitched way. Uncle found this very strange. At least strange enough to mention to us. Professor wanted the farm, but didn't want to work it. She wanted to own it on paper and have the uncle and her husband work it. She went as far as to push her husband to contest the sale he had with uncle a few years back to gain a partial ownership. This went nowhere of course. Uncle did have to hire a lawyer, but it didn't even make it to court. Him and the rest of the family refused to talk to father-in-law after that. I was curious so I had to know why the professor blew up at me when I said I was blessed to have a wife. He chuckled a bit. Really kicked the hornet's nest, huh? He said. First night the professor was staying with uncle and his wife prepared dinner. They got to the table and uncle was about to say grace. My wife blushed when he brought this up, apparently this is a very embarrassing memory for her. Professor blew up. She said something about how this family doesn't say grace. Uncle shrugged, he wanted to be accommodating and responded that she didn't have to join if she didn't want to. She tried to push it further. As long as she was in that house, there would be no saying grace. Uncle said this was the first time he was rude to the professor. He told her that there was no way a guest was telling him what he could and couldn't do in his own home. After hearing about the sheep farm, I will get in touch with a lawyer. We'll see how that goes. Update 3, my psychopathic mother-in-law tried to steal my farm. Well, it finally happened. The mother-in-law, also known as the professor, and father-in-law are in jail. 2 nights ago the sheriff called us in the middle of the day. My wife picked up and after a few minutes of chatting she started laughing. She told me what the sheriff told her. It seems the professor and the father-in-law decided they wanted to try to sneak onto our land. The professor decided that instead of trying to get onto the ranch from the farm road, which we have a clear view of from the house, that her and father-in-law decided to park a little ways away, and try to get onto our land via a neighbor's property. My neighbor to the east has a small orchard and is a hobby beekeeper. He doesn't get a lot of honey a year and what he does he shares or sells at the farmer's market. Field chickweed just started to flow here, so the bees were out. The professor apparently stumbled onto his bee boxes, and I mean literally bumped into one. The bees started swarming her and either her or father-in-law got mad and kicked one of the boxes over. My neighbor keeps a sensor perimeter around his bee boxes in case of bears, so that went off and he ran to his bee boxes to see two middle-aged people running around, swatting at bees and yelling. Neighbor called the sheriff, and after about 20 minutes of the neighbor trying to smoke the bees and hosing them off, promptly pressed charges for the destruction of his bee box and trespassing. Apparently there are additional charges for disrupting and destroying a farm's agricultural capability, and since his bees are pollinators for his orchard, away the two went. Both were apparently covered in stings and are in county lockup now.